morning. My name is Chris Lecluse. I am a solution specialist within Teletrack Navman. It's a title I don't really understand, so I don't expect you to either. A little bit of my background, how I got into this space. I'm all about driver safety. I was a policeman in WA for 20 years. I did a lot of the time as a patrolman on the highway, crash investigator and a police driver trainer. What I learned in those 20 years is that road trauma is avoidable. Okay, too many people die on the world's roads and on Australian roads. And it's not until you're actually faced with a dead body on the road that you see the impact it has on people. When we investigate these fatal collisions, the thing that stood out to me for all those years was that it was avoidable. No other way of saying it, it's us, the humans, that are at fault. Somebody has done something wrong. And how we found that out was there are usually three types of emergency services that attend the scene of these major collisions. The ambulance turn up to try and revive the injured parties. The fire brigade turns up to cut the parties out of the vehicles. The police turn up not to direct traffic, but to identify who did something wrong. And invariably, someone did something wrong, which led to that fatality. Vehicles do not crash themselves yet without us. So the government has spent a lot of time and effort in implementing strategies to ensure that drivers are safer on the roads. Any time a large vehicle falls off the road, it makes the headlines nationally. Transport organisations can ill afford to have their name, their brand, plastered on the television at the scene of a collision whereby that vehicle has killed an innocent party. And when it does, the brand or the reputational damage is often irreversible. So the government has recognised that there needs to be change. And they've implemented laws to affect that change. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So first we're going to look at some of the statistics worldwide about people dying. Does anyone want to have a stab in the dark as to how many people die annually on the world's roads?
Less than, a plane is less than on the roads.
Yeah, you're much safer in a plane than you are on the roads. 1.25 million people die every year.
How many in trucks?
I couldn't break that down from a global perspective, but that does not only include drivers. See, road trauma is indiscriminate. It does not target just drivers, or it doesn't target just people that have done something wrong. Many times the perpetrator survives. It's the innocent parties that die. And like I said, it's indiscriminate. It doesn't care whether you're male, female, young, old, white, black, whatever the case may be, it doesn't matter. Unfortunately, I've put every type of person in a plastic bag. And it's not until you knock on the door of that person's house and advise a loved one that that person's never coming home again. That's when it really hits home. And I can remember every time I knocked on a door. So I set myself a target. Let's educate. Let's help people recognise how dangerous the roads are. 1.25 million might look like just a number to you, but behind every one of those numbers is a family. Somebody woke up the day of their death not recognising the fact that they weren't going home. And it's left a legacy to their family. And we have the ability to do something about it. That's the great tragedy. 50 million people suffer non-fatal injuries. So we're talking some significant numbers globally. Road injuries are on track to become the 5th leading cause of death by 2030. We're not talking about unnatural death, we're talking about death. So by 2030 it's going to be the 5th largest taker of lives from something that is avoidable. So we have legislation, and this is what I was talking about with the government. Who is responsible? What are those responsibilities? And what are the ramifications? So we have 3 tiers of compliance that the government has implemented. The first one is any vehicle that is used for a work purpose falls under the gambit of workplace health and safety legislation. It doesn't have to be a work-supplied vehicle. It just has to be a vehicle that is used for a work purpose. If you employ an individual or a contractor and you remunerate them for the use of a vehicle for a work task, that constitutes a work vehicle. Grey fleet, privately owned vehicles for which companies pay fuel or mileage, they fall under workplace health and safety legislation. And if you are engaging an organisation or engaging an individual to operate a vehicle on your behalf, you are responsible. Secondly, vehicles above 4.5 tonnes. They fall under, as well as workplace health and safety, they also fall under a new legislation called chain of responsibility. And the whole idea behind the chain of responsibility is it's shifting the sole focus of investigations away from just the driver, and now it's including every individual who forms part of the logistical chain for a transport operation. So that's every vehicle above 4.5 tonne. And it reaches right up to the top. Company owners, chairmen, directors, executives. If you hold a position of influence within an organisation where vehicles are utilised, and those vehicles are in excess of 4.5 tonne, you are responsible. And it extends all the way through to the organisation that has contracted you to deliver goods. If they place unrealistic time demands on you, then if an incident occurs which triggers an investigation, they may be found liable. As an example, in the old days, the large supermarkets would contract transport organisations to deliver goods from the central base to their supermarket. And quite often they would say, I don't care how you get it there, I need it there by X. Now when you do the math, the only way to achieve X is by either A, exceeding the speed limit, or B, exceeding the amount of hours you have available to you on your logbook. Thus forcing drivers to exceed the speed limits or break some other law. And then when the inevitable occurred and the vehicle fell off the road and killed somebody, no one went to the supermarket and said, well, you placed unrealistic demands. That was the impetus behind the chain of responsibility legislation, to ensure that whether you're the dispatcher, whether you're the loader of the goods into the vehicle, whether you're the maintenance manager, whether you're the fleet manager or the operations manager, you have a duty of care to be responsible for your area of concern. And if you fail in your duty of care, then you will be investigated under this law. A little known fact, since this law has been introduced here on the eastern seaboard alone, there have been in excess of 4,500 successful prosecutions under chain of responsibility. So to bluff yourself into thinking that you can get away with it, the way the legislation is written from the top down under workplace health and safety legislation, it no longer says that you can dig a hole and stick your head in the sand. You cannot use ignorance as a defence under this law, because there are two main statements that it says. The first one is you need to be proactive in the identification of all risks. Now when we go back to the slide before and we see the figures as to how many people are dying on the roads, we know what the greatest risk exposure is. What a lot of people don't know is that fully 2/3 of all workplace fatalities occur in or around a vehicle. So where we look at that requirement to be proactive in the identification of risks, that's number one, vehicle use. The second part is hard, and it states that you need to be proactive in the mitigation of those identified risks. So you need to be proactive. That's why you can't bury your head in the sand. In the bad old days you could, and that's why they targeted the drivers. But now, as you'll see with some case studies, if you bury your head in the sand, you will be found liable. And finally, number three is under the NHVR, any vehicle over 12.5 tonne must maintain a paperwork diary for the hours worked. Now, if you had a look at the rule sets, the various rule sets which govern the use of heavy vehicles in transport operations which exceed 100 kilometres, or in the case of livestock 150 kilometres, you need to be a mathematician or a physicist to understand the overlapping rule sets. They are difficult to understand and get your head around. And this is what we expect our drivers out there to live by, and it's unfair. It's very easy for the regulators and the road managers such as the TMR or the police to identify a breach of the rule sets. It's very difficult for the drivers to maintain that competency. However, technology aids us now. We have available devices which show very clearly to a driver when an impending breach is approaching. It can notify that driver 30 minutes or 1 hour prior to the breach that you need to take a break, and that break needs to be at least 15 minutes or whatever that breach may be. It can help back office staff with rostering to identify does that driver possess the number of hours required to undertake that task? If not, that person is not going to be made available for that task. So technology is helping, and what we're trying to do is streamline it, make it easier for the drivers so that they're not falling out of compliance. The whole point about compliance is not because the government wants to find fault with you. It is to keep the drivers safe. And who are we trying to keep them safe from?
Themselves.
Yeah, themselves. Safe workplace. A safe workplace now constitutes employees, contractors, subcontractors, directors, safety officers, operations managers and job schedulers. It is not limited to that. Just recognise if you hold a position of influence within an organisation, that is open to interpretation. And believe me, almost any position can be a position of influence. And if you failed in your duty of care, then you may be liable. So we're going to look at some very quick case studies. In one instance, there was a failure to provide safe vehicles. There was a transport organisation transporting fuels, and it was a nationwide company. The company had a fantastic name when it was owned by the original owner. It came time to sell, and they sold to a huge organisation. And as often occurs in these situations, the new organisation said, profit above all else. How many times have we heard that? No one's going to say it out loud, but we know it happens. Now, the original owner of these vehicles, when the tanker trailers were unserviceable, he put them out to pasture because it was not economical for him to maintain the serviceability of those trailers. But when the new organisation came in, they saw this fleet of tanker trailers sitting there and thought, well, if I can fill them with fuel, I can get more trucks on the road, I can gain more revenue. And that's what they did without doing their due diligence. And one of the trucks came over a hill in Mona Vale in New South Wales, went down a hill towards an intersection where there were vehicles stopped at a red light, civilian vehicles. And when the driver put the brakes on, the trailer had no brakes. That's why it was meant to be out to pasture. And the organisation failed to ensure that the trailers were safe. As a result, the tanker trailer came down the hill and careered into an intersection where there were stationary vehicles. The ensuing fireball killed or incinerated 2 innocent victims. Now, when we look at the fines that were meted out to that organisation, it totaled something like $50,000. So for a large organisation, they can absorb that sort of money. But what the NHVR did was grounded the entire fleet nationally until every single vehicle and trailer could be inspected. Not only that, but like I said, that name was plastered over the media for months. As a result, that company now gone under because they lost all their contracts. No one wanted a bar of them. So in their short-term goal of maximising profits, 2 innocent victims got killed, which is what I take umbrage to, and the entire company fell under. In the second case, we're looking at a failure to mitigate an identified risk. There was a transport organisation, very similar to the first instance. However, what occurred was the driver knew this particular vehicle was a small operation. The driver recognised that the vehicle in question that he was asked to drive didn't have brakes. So what he did was he approached the owner of this organisation and said, look, I'm not going to drive that vehicle because it's unsafe. It does not have brakes. And the owner of the organisation, in his wisdom, turned to the driver and said, I know I can drive that vehicle. You have to drive that vehicle, and if you don't, you're out the door. Now, the individual had a mortgage, had a family to support, could ill afford to lose his job. So unfortunately, he was forced to drive that vehicle. Now, in a scenario eerily similar to the first instance, he approached an intersection where there were vehicles stationary at the red light, applied the brakes and could not stop the vehicle. But rather than driving into those stationary vehicles, he took the vehicle off-road and collided with a tree. Unfortunately, the driver died. The result, for the owner of the company, he didn't get charged under the legislation that we've looked at. It was a criminal charge of manslaughter now. And he's now got 12 years to contemplate the error of his ways. So the government's deadly serious about these legislations, about keeping people alive and ensuring that the people that perpetrate these offences are brought to justice. And we ignored worker concerns. So there is the first two instances were triggered by single events. There's a national transport organisation that traversed New South Wales. Now, they weren't a New South Wales operator, but what they did was every time they drove, because they were on unrealistic deadlines, they exceeded the speed limit. And by exceeding the speed limit, they thought that they would get to their destination sooner. In a 4-year period, they had incurred 165 speeding infringements by various authorities, just in New South Wales. So you can imagine from a national scale what those figures would have looked like. Eventually, when the legislation came in, the New South Wales authorities decided to take the organisation to task for failing to mitigate an identified risk. They knew over 4 years that they continued to get speeding tickets, and the company just paid them. Did they mitigate the identified risk? They know the risk existed because they got speeding tickets. Did they mitigate those risks? No, because over 4 years, they continued to get these tickets. The result was a $1 million fine to the organisation. Now, that's a significant hit. Furthermore, the company director incurred a $50,000 fine personally. Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to go home and tell my wife that I've got a $50,000 fine. So, the penalties are real. The consequences are real. And that's a term I want to talk about, consequences. Before we do so, obviously from Teletrack Navman, we do the telematics. Telematics has various names, GPS tracking, and some uglier names, if you will. But sometimes people don't always understand how the technology works. So essentially, we need a vehicle, because it's mobile tracking technology. We install a device commonly referred to as a black box. Simply put, it's a computer. And if you will, you may as well look at that like a phone. It contains a SIM card because it needs to communicate information about the vehicle's location to a server. And in order to do that, it's got to bounce the data off of the cell towers. And that then goes back to our server where we collate all the relevant information and produce it to you as a fleet manager and give it to you as a program on your computer. Doesn't matter if it's a desktop, a laptop, a phone, a tablet, you have access to understand where your fleet is and what they're doing. Why is it so important to be transparent about where the vehicles are? Do you think drivers like this technology? Of course they don't. What are some of the terms we hear drivers talk about this technology as?
Big brother.
Big brother. Of course we do. And we, as an industry, in the telematics industry, have to take some of the blame. Because when we go and talk to organisations, we talk to the executives. And rarely do we get a chance to talk to the drivers. Yet they're the ones who are quite often most influenced or affected by this. And without them knowing what this technology is, they just know that their bosses now can tell where they are, where they've been, and how they got there. And they don't like that. But you know what? That's the wrong message to be sending them. This is all about their safety. And why do we need for them to understand it's all about their safety? Because there are barriers to safety. The number one barrier to safe driving is a reluctance to learn a new behaviour. So in my background, I've done international driver training for transport industry globally for over 10 years now. I used to do the stuff where I sat beside the driver, and then we went to simulators, and then online. And every time I go to these professional drivers, they say the same thing. What are you going to teach me? Because, and I've got to say this, sorry guys, we're our own worst enemies. We do not believe that we can improve our driving. Yet I can prove every single one of you in here can get better. There's no such thing as a perfect driver. And we know that because people are still killing themselves on the roads. And it's a reluctance to learn a new behaviour. If you contemplate or think for a minute about when you got your licence the first time, is that how you drive now? You may think that it was pretty bad back then. But the reality is you're probably a lot more compliant than you are now. It's not okay to exceed the speed limit. Doesn't matter what type of vehicle you are driving. Doesn't matter how good the road surface is. It's not okay to exceed the speed limit. That's what the term implies. It's not okay to drive while under the influence of alcohol or drugs. It's not okay to drive when you've been driving for 17 or 18 hours. Because that's what happens. Now, it's not only about your drivers. It's about their ability to identify errant behaviours in others. It's not always your drivers who are doing things wrong. So this technology, more often than not, from our experience, corroborates the version of events of your drivers, because they will have a lot of stories about idiots in cars chopping them off and doing stupid things that impact their ability to drive their load safely. And that's what this technology is there to do. Corroborate what they're trying to do as the right thing. So look at the psychology of driving. Very quickly, we break it down into ABCs: activators, behaviours and consequences. This is talking about why people take at-risk behaviours. Every single one of you in this room can think about something you do when you drive which isn't quite right. You justify it to yourself. It's okay to go 5 over the limit. It's okay to roll through that stop sign. It's okay to change lanes without having indicated. But is it okay? Because what are the consequences? Activators. What is the activator to speed, for instance?
Frustration.
Running late. A desire to reach your destination sooner. That's what we make ourselves believe. The behaviour is that we do in fact speed. Varying degrees. And as a telematics company, I can tell you exactly how much people speed. But the consequences is where it gets difficult to understand. That's split into two. There's the perceived positive consequences of at-risk driving, which is that I'm actually going to get to my destination sooner. But the real negative consequence is that you place yourself at a heightened risk of prosecution and road trauma. I can tell you straight away, especially in an urban environment, speeding rarely gets you to your destination sooner. All it does is gets you to the next stop sign or red light sooner. Everyone eventually catches up, but they didn't speed to get there. But we justify it in our minds. So what we have to do is stop thinking about the perceived positive consequence and focus on the actual negative consequence of our actions. We have to be disciplined in ourselves to understand what the ramifications are of our driving behaviours. And without something like a telematics device, it's very difficult for someone to understand exactly how out of compliant they are or non-compliant they are. And that's what we're aiming to do. And by doing that, we assist your drivers by meeting the government regulations. So how do we act upon that data for the driver safety? Remember, this is all about driver safety. That's why the government is so hell-bent on introducing these laws. We set driver goals rather than KPIs. If you set KPIs for people, they believe in their mind that if they don't meet their KPIs, they're gone. But if you set goals, that's something to attain. That's something to reach for. And there are ways to do that. We want to make this a positive impact for drivers, not negative. Create a competitive culture towards safe driving. We quite often do that by posting driving reports in a lunchroom. And we banned it, green, amber and red. If your name appears in that red zone, you're not feeling so good about yourself all of a sudden because everyone else sees that. So we're driving a culture towards safe driving. And rewarding, sorry?
Could that be seen as bullying?
Could it be seen as bullying? No, because you're encouraging your organisation, your drivers, to be safe, and that makes them and you compliant.
But does that could be seen as pitting one against the other? So
You're not pitting them one against it. All you're doing is displaying a set of facts. It's not innuendo. It's purely facts. And that's what these are. It's data derived from the individual.
yeah, just raising awareness.
That's right. Now, but if you start acting upon that, if you start looking at those red band drivers and pointing the finger, now we've got an issue.
Yeah.
But subliminally, just by posting, and that's just one example, just by posting that data sheet, people change their behaviours, and we see that. And rewarding for best or the consistent drivers. So rather than starting to target those red zone drivers, what we're doing is showing the culture of rewarding the best drivers. So it gives those errant drivers something to aim for. So that's how we get around, not because we want to get around it, it's just not bullying.
Yeah.
Okay? So the key learnings are, be aware of the legislation. A key part of that, remember, workplace health and safety legislation around the country, and in particular in Queensland, changed in 2011-2012 to specifically include motor vehicles as a workplace. So all considerations that we would normally have for a physical building like this, we include in a vehicle. Not necessarily about slips, trips and falls, but about what constitutes a hazard. And there is a legislative requirement to understand the risks and to mitigate those risks. Be proactive. Make sure you do your due diligence. Ensure that your company driving policies are understood. This is a really key area for a lot of organisations. And for those of you that do have drivers or who have fallen under this gambit in the past, you'll recognise that most companies simply on induction day give the driver a stack of paperwork to sign, one of which is that I've read and understood the driving policy of the company. But very few of them actually have read or understood the policy. And that's now being tested out in the courts. Because if a driver is charged and he can successfully argue that, look, they gave me a stack of papers on my first day, I wanted a job, I signed anything they put in front of me, I didn't read it, guess what, there's a loophole. So we've got to ensure that the driving policy reflects the legislation, reflects the technology, and is made that the drivers are understanding it. So quite often we implement a test for the drivers to understand the contents of that policy. We do the pre-vehicle checks, that's legislated. If a vehicle is not assigned to an individual and it changes hands, it has to be inspected before every journey. Otherwise, a new driver can inherit the damage caused by somebody else, and now he's in the hot seat. Now, it identifies a driver's exposure to danger, fatigue management policies. For vehicles that are under 12.5 tonnes, don't think that you don't have to meet fatigue management policies. You do. It's just legislated tighter for vehicles in excess of 12.5 tonnes. If you know that your drivers are tired, heaven forbid if one of your drivers say to you, I'm tired, and you say, you'll be right, off you go. Because that's what happens. But if that driver falls off the road, now you're in the hot seat. Existing driving behaviours, that's real key. If you know there's a problem with your driver's behaviours, you need to act. And I haven't seen much data from perfect drivers yet. So we need to raise the awareness. Don't be afraid of showing the drivers the data. Their only fear, I can guarantee you, is not that they're bad drivers. Is that their only fear is that they're going to lose their job because of this data. And that's what we don't want. It's much more economical to retrain errant drivers than to kick them out and start with someone you don't know anything about. And that's the message we want to communicate to our drivers. Don't look at this as a target on your back, but as someone looking over you. And journey management procedures. That's a concept which a lot of people miss. Journey management is not dispatch. Journey management is understanding things such as a circadian rhythm and how that impacts on people's ability to start a journey at night time, for instance. What's their diet look like? Where's their journey going to? Have they got enough hours of sleep under their belt? Have they got enough hours on their logbook to complete the journey? Do they know where they're going? Do they know how to get there? Do they know what to do in case of an emergency? Do they know what to do should a tyre blow out? That's what journey management is, understanding every aspect of the job, knowing that they can complete that job safely. So there's a lot more to driving than just jumping in the vehicle and steering that thing. Remember, ignorance is no defence. If a customer is unsure or doesn't have a relevant policy, they will still be liable if there's an incident. So essentially, don't wait for something to go wrong. If something goes wrong, it will trigger an investigation, whether it be from the police, the TMR, Safe Work Queensland. An investigation will ensue, and if they can identify that there was a lapse somewhere, then there's a good chance. Now, what I do want to highlight is that some of those case studies were cherry-picked purely because they were the big ones. Don't think that every breach is going to carry an imprisonment term or $1 million fine. That's not the case. Okay, they can be very small penalties. They can even be improvement notices, for instance. It doesn't have to be a penalty. The intent of the legislation is to improve worker safety. So this is one of the driver training modules that we have available to us. We go online now because it's far more economical, it's far easier to reach our targeted audience, and it's far more consistent. So by doing this and relaying that back to the telematics, to their driving behaviours, we're not only identifying the risk, but now we're mitigating the risk in real time. And that's what you want to be able to achieve. That's what you're going to be asked to demonstrate should things go pear-shaped. I'm going to pass it on to, who's next? Les?
We got, so thanks Chris, yeah, we got Jay coming up.
Jay.
Jay's from NTI, so thanks Chris.
Thank you very much.